Okay, well, I am just so thrilled to be here. My name is Kathleen Royston. I am the head yarn wench of Republica Unicornia Yarns. I started my own business, so I gave myself my own job title. And I learned how to knit in 2017. I was in the middle of a major life transition. And it was a thing that kept me together. And when I started knitting, I started buying lots and lots of hand dyed yarn, like a lot of us do. And I had done a lot of fiber dyeing and fabric dyeing. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to learn how to dye yarn in my kitchen just for fun, just for me. And since I was in the middle of this major life transition, it very, very quickly escalated into a much bigger than my kitchen kind of production. So I've been officially in business since 2018. And my motto is hand dyed yarns and notions for the color obsessed. And I am very much obsessed with colors and unicorns, as the name of my business suggests. So that's just a little bit, and I'm going to be answering questions as we go. I feel sort of like Yarn Julia Child right now. So if I light stuff on fire, we'll deal with it. I shouldn't. So if you have knit with hand dyed yarn, I'm guessing a lot of you have, it is a fairly involved process to make it. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of dyeing and going to actually dye some yarn and talk a lot about the equipment and everything that's involved and goes into it so you can kind of see start from to finish what actually happens. So behind me, can y'all see this? This is my yarn cabinet. It is actually not a yarn cabinet. It is a bread proofer and holding cabinet like it's a piece of restaurant supply equipment. And fibers that are animal fibers, so wool, silk, things like that, require heat and acid to dye the yarn. And so my yarn cabinet is basically like a big crock pot. When I started in my kitchen. You can dye beautiful yarn at home in a pan that you get at Goodwill. I do recommend only using your dye equipment for dye, not for food. But I started out with IKEA roasting pans on my 4-burner apartment stove. And so you can absolutely do this at home. There are some safety things that we'll talk about and things like that. I use the cabinet because I'm a production dyer. And so I need to be able to do a fair amount at a time. And it became very clear a few months ago, maybe about a year ago, that there was no way I was going to be able to keep dyeing yarn in our apartment kitchen with white laminate countertops. And so I have a studio in the West End of Atlanta. I'm at a complex called Mutiny Artworks, which is fantastic. And in non-pandemic times, we do open studio times and all kinds of fun stuff. So that's where I am. So the yarn cabinet is a lot like a crock pot. So it warms up the yarn slowly. It takes a little bit longer, but I can do a lot at once. We're just going to do one pan today. So a couple of things. You need yarn. I'm going to show you. Okay, I'm going to wander off 1 second. I'm back. When yarn comes to me, it comes to me in bags and a hot mess. And you have to prepare yarn when you're going to dye yarn. You prepare it, and you do that by soaking it. And so I have some yarn soaking. I'm going to talk a little bit first about fibers that I use. I like wool. And one of the things I did not know before I started dyeing yarn and before I started knitting was that there are a lot of different kinds of sheep. It's not just one kind of sheep. And so I really prefer, there are a couple of breeds that I really prefer. What I'm going to dye today is Tarkey, which is a U.S. breed sheep and is a hybrid of, I can't remember, a couple of kinds of sheep. It is a U.S. breed. It is U.S. milled, U.S. processed. So it's an all U.S. fiber. And the yarn is fantastic. It's got it's kind of plump. It's going to be a fingering weight yarn, but it's kind of puffy. And it's soft and sturdy, and I really love it. It does some weird things in the dye pot, which can be kind of exciting, but it's really nice. The other fiber that I am especially fond of is a British sheep breed called Blueface Leicester, which is a little bit, if you've ever knit with merino, it's a little bit sheepier than merino. It has a little bit more texture to it. It has beautiful stitch definition. It's fantastic. I love it. And I dye what I want to dye because I have this crippling fear that no one's ever going to buy my yarn and I'm going to be stuck with it all. And so I just dye what I want to knit with. So we're going to go ahead and talk about equipment. So I don't know. Can y'all see? Hold on. I'm going to tip this down. Okay. So Equipment. I'm going to keep kicking that. So that's going to be fun. So the dyes that you use, if you've ever done tie dyeing, you have probably used fiber reactive dyes. The dyes that you use for protein fibers are a little bit different. They're acid dyes. And it sounds very intimidating because, oh my gosh, acid. But it's actually either just vinegar or citric acid. I prefer citric acid because then your house doesn't smell like hot, wet, pickled sheep. It just smells like hot, wet sheep. And so the dyes that you use, I'm going to tell you the company that I use because I love them. It's Dharma Trading Company. They're out of California. They've been in business, I think, since the 60s. They're great for all of your dye needs. If you decide you want to do this at home, you can also buy undyed yarn there and not massive production scale quantities, and it's pretty reasonably priced. So they're a great source. So I buy all of my dyes from Dharma Trading Company. There's another brand, the Dharma House brand is cheaper. There's another brand called Jacquard. There's another brand, I think it's called Prochem. Is that right? I don't use them. I just really like Dharma. So they come in all kinds of colors. You can also do a lot of color mixing of your own. And so if you decide that you don't like the colors that they have, you can mix your own. So that's the big thing is the dye. And I mentioned the citric acid. You can use vinegar. I think the volume of vinegar just gets to be a little much. So I just order giant bags of citric acid. So you do that. Mason jars are really helpful. They're easy to wash. I use plastic sometimes, but I like the glass. We're going to talk a little bit about when we get to the speckling, which is the super fun part. But I use tiny little strainers for speckling, which is when you do dye powder that's not in a solution. And so that's how you get the fun little bits that you see often in hand-dyed yarn. A spoon. I'm very attached to this spoon. It's a demi-tasse spoon, the vintage one. It's silver. It makes me feel fancy. Whisks, like tiny little bar whisks, are good because we're going to put some dye in solution and make what's called dye stock. So it's really helpful for that. When I soak the yarn, and I'll show you that in a second, when I soak the yarn, I put my yarn on shower curtain rings to stop it from getting all tangled. And a spatula for stirring stuff around. That's not very exciting. Pan. This is stainless steel. It's a restaurant hotel pan. Again, I liked when I was doing this at home, and I still have them. The $9.99 IKEA roasting pans are great. So that's that. And this is you get really buff doing this a lot. I have yarn muscles, which is great. So here's the yarn that's been soaking. It's just soaking in water. I soaked it overnight. And that just helps with the process. That's just part of it. Okay, so there's that. Safety. Okay, so the dyes themselves are not toxic, particularly. I don't think they're great for you, but they're not particularly toxic. But they are particulates. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Just checking. Sorry, I'm having weird feedback. Just want to make sure everybody can hear me. So you have to be careful, especially if you're doing a lot of dyeing, about the particulates getting into your lungs. It's not great for you. So I have a super sexy respirator. It's an N95, so it's good for particulates. We've gotten a little more familiar with things like this that we might have otherwise wanted to be in the last few months. So I do use a respirator. If you decide you want to try this at home, you can use just like a home, like the hardware store has N95 masks that are just really simple that go over your face. And since we live in pandemic times, you may have one lying around. So when I actually get to the dyeing, I'm going to put this on and not be able to talk, but it's really important. And I also wear gloves. One, your hands are in water a lot, but also it's just not great for your skin. You can develop, if you've got your hands in dye all the time, you can develop an allergy. And so these are going to be sticky and obnoxious. So these are actually my hairdresser buys me my gloves. They're the best. I'm going to have to maybe get a new pair of them. Okay. Is everybody with me? Y'all here?
Yeah, we're doing well.
Okay, good. It's weird not having a room of people to talk to and not getting feedback. So hi. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and put on gloves. Super fun. And the colorway that I'm going to dye today is called Strange But Not a Stranger. I name a lot of my colors after song lyrics because I listen to a lot of music. And so this comes from a Talking Heads song, the Talking Heads song, Burning Down the House, which I dance to poorly in my studio frequently. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up what is called dye stock. And so that's just dye in solution. And if you do this at home and you decide you want to, you can kind of experiment with the concentration that you want. If you are a baker, yarn dyeing will come very naturally to you. It's a lot about ratios, and so you kind of figure out, and so I figured out early on what was the ratio of dye that worked for me, and I can kind of adjust that up and down and get different tones and different saturations, and it's very fun to play with. But I'm just going to go ahead and do the dye stock, whereas, one thing I did not talk about, I use scales. This is a tiny one that I use because we're just talking about a little bit of dye, of powdered dye. And so I'm going to use this one, and then I use a bigger one when it comes time to actually put stuff in solution. So sexy respirator going on. Handy bar with. So once the dye is in solution, you don't have to worry about it so much. So if you are doing a color that is a lot of liquid dye stock, then you don't have to wear a mask unless you're mixing it up. So, but if the jars are open, I'm going to wear a mask because I don't want to die of the rainbow lung. So a little bit about sort of different things you can do. So if you use a lot of dye stock of the liquid dye in solution like this, it's super attractive looking, you can that's a good way to get sort of more solid colors or semi-solid colors, or my favorite, which are tonals, which is yarn where you have a lot of different colors, of especially colors in the same color family, so you get a lot of depth of color. That's my favorite. So that's what I do a lot of. Or you can do speckles, and so we're going to do kind of a combination of both. Strange But Not a Stranger has speckles and it has dye stock, so you can kind of see a little bit. So can y'all see? Good. Okay, so what I'm going to do is first I'm going to put citric acid in. So this is the acid part of the acid dyes. So these dyes start working on the fiber when there is acid and heat present. So we're going to take care of the first part of the acid.
Kathleen?
Yes.
What's that stuff you're mixing with it? Because I assumed that was the acid. Is that just water in that jar?
What, this jug?
Yeah.
Yeah, just water. It's warm water.
Okay, so you mix your colour with warm water?
Yes. Yeah, it helps it. Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. It helps it dissolve. It helps it dissolve a little bit more. And I usually mix the dye stock the night before to give it time to settle. There are some colors, and I found this when I was doing fiber reactive dyeing too. There are some colors that just do not want to dissolve in solution. And so it's urea helps, I think, oxygenate it. I'm not a chemist, but I think that's what happens. And so there are some colors, because some colors will get weird and clumpy or won't dissolve. Yellows are especially bad. So if you get really intense into this, you can use urea to help dissolve stuff. These I didn't, but I have. So. Okay. So we have a solution. It's pretty acidic. See, this I actually do know. You want a pH of 1 or 2, and I know that because I played with the test strips. That is just kind of the level. You want it pretty acidy. which you'd think would destroy the fiber, but it does not at all. I don't know. It's magic. Chemistry is magic. Okay, so I got my tub O yarn, and I'm gonna squeeze it out. Maybe. It's also messy. Like I towels. If you want to try this at home, you're gonna need so many towels. Unless you're a very neat person, which I am not. And so just, get ready with your towels.
How much yarn is in each of those skeins?
So each one of these is about 115 grams of the tarhi. And so I can do 4 at once. Sometimes I'll do smaller dye lots. Like sometimes the really saturated tonals that I was talking about, they don't like to share space. And so I'll get light spots if I do bigger dye lots. But this one is fine for this. So it's a lot. And like when I was talking about my yarn muscles, I was not kidding. Like I hate working out, and I have discovered this is a lovely substitute. Okay. So let me move that. That is not an attractive thing. Okay. Okay. Can y'all see yarn? I think you can. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pour these colors over it. So this is it's like an ivory and a light brown. So this is like kind of the base coat. So you can see this is not a particularly, parts of this are an exact science, but not all of it, which is why there's so much variation in hand-dyed yarn. And it can be an adjustment. I think if you're used to knitting with or working with in any way commercial yarn, it can be a little bit of an adjustment that there's so much variation in hand-dyed yarn, which I think is what makes it fabulous. But I do recommend, as does everybody else, that when you work with it, that you alternate skeins just to kind of, so you don't get like weird lumps of anything, blobs of color. Okay. So, and I'm just flipping it and doing the back. I'm gonna squish it around, make a mess, get a towel. Okay. I'm gonna move my screen down a little bit so y'all can see, because I'm not the interesting part here. Okay. Ta-da. So we got our base coat on. I'm gonna just kind of even it out and move it around and find another towel. Seriously, y'all, so many towels. Okay. So I'm gonna do speckles. So again, if you have knit with hand-dyed yarn, you have seen a speckle. It is nothing more than dry dye that goes on yarn. And there's a couple of ways you can do it. I prefer the little strainer. Some people do it by sprinkling. I like the strainer. It's fine. And there's a lot of things. So like I said, the dye comes in a bunch of different colors. And you can do, one of the things I'm going to do, which I do for this colorway that I started doing just to get a little bit more depth of color, is you can mix the dry dyes together and make your own custom speckles mixes. So some of my colorways, including this one, uses custom speckles mixes. So that's what I'm going to be doing. So the little jars that I have here, it's just, you'll see, it's just dry dye mixed together, but it's like a bunch of different colors. And so when they hit the yarn, all the little different dye particles do magical, wonderful things, so, which we like. So I'm going to put my respirator back on. So I'm not going to be talking. Here. Okay, and that is round one. And so what I'm going to do, I'm gonna clean it up a little bit since no, that's like way too much me. Okay, there we go. A nice mix. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna stick it in the cabinet. If you decide you wanna do this at home and you're doing it on the stove top, there's some different timing things. So think about the difference if you've ever made dinner like in the crock pot. You just kind of throw everything in cold and then walk away and leave it. That's more or less what the yarn cabinet is like. If you are cooking, like if you're making a roast or something on the stovetop, you have to pay attention to it and you have to, do different things. So it's like that with dyeing. And so if you are doing this on the stovetop, what you do is citric acid in, yarn in, water in, yarn in. And then if you're going to do speckles, you bring it up to temperature. You can change things if you're doing it on the stovetop, depending on when you add the dye. If you're going to use dye stock, if I was doing this colorway on the stovetop, I would add dye stock when it was cold and then bring it up to temperature and then speckle it and then heat it up and then let it sit for a little bit and then heat it up again and flip it. But what I'm going to do in the cabinet is I'm just going to it's basically cold right now. I'm going to go ahead and stick it in and let it cook for like an hour and then flip it and then do the back and let it cook for another hour. So I like to use lids. It makes things a lot more efficient. I did not for a very long time when I was cooking on the stove. I did not have lids in my fancy $9.99 IKEA roasting pans, but I really, really like the lids for the cabinet because otherwise it just takes a really long time. The ambient temperature of the cabinet is between like 190 and 200 degrees. And so if you kind of want to conserve energy as much as possible, it really is just like a crock pot. So I'm going to go ahead and stick this in. Oof. And it does its thing. And so, that's how that works. And so if I'm going to do a production day, I will do 24 pans of 4 skeins of yarn at a time a day. And so I had this vision of moving into the studio was going to just be like, I have an armchair. Like I thought I was going to take naps. I thought it was going to be this leisurely process. It is not. It is because by the time you get everything in, you set the time, it's fast, furious craziness. There's water everywhere and pans everywhere. And then you finally get everything in and set the timer for an hour and you have to clean up. And so it is not there are 0 naps happening at the studio, which is fine. It's fine. But I can do a lot more and it's a lot more efficient. So after the yarn so what I will do is in an hour, we're not together anymore. I'll go ahead and flip it and speckle the back and let it set again. And then I'll let it cool overnight. And then the next day I will wash it out. And so I use wool wash. I just stick it in a plastic tub of wool wash and I let it soak just to get out any residual stuff. If you've ever tie-dyed and it looks like you've entered a unicorn slaughterhouse when you're washing out your shirt, acid dyes are not like that. They exhaust pretty much completely, which means that there's not going to be a lot of leftover dye, but there can still be a little bit, and certain colors are kind of fussy. So I will wash it out and just to get the last little bit of dye out. And then I have a spin dryer, which is basically like a giant electric salad spinner, and to get all the water out. And then I let it dry. And then I skein it. And I have a skein twister that is essentially a meat hook on a motor to help me twist skeins so they look nice and even and my elbows don't fall off. And then I label it. And then I photograph it. And then I put it in the shop. And so it is a fairly long process start to finish with a skein of hand-dyed yarn. Now, if you're doing it for yourself at home, it is not as crazy. But as a business, it's a long process. There is some hands-off time, but there is a lot of hands-on time. So if you've ever bought hand-dyed yarn and wondered about why it is so freaking expensive, that is a lot of it. The labor that goes into every skein is significant. So that's that. I'm trying. Are there questions? We have quite a bit of time. That was like too fast, too furious. Everything I know about yarn.
I was so if you have any questions, please you can use the raise your hand feature on the bottom of your screen, or you can just throw them in the chat and we will take questions. I was also wondering while we're doing that, do you have any like samples of your already dyed yarn to hand that we could see?
Oh yes, and I even have the colorway that we're dyeing right now. So I'm gonna move. There's gonna be like rainbow explosion behind me. Okay.
Wow.
So this is not all of it. This is very fancy. My laptop stand is the container with the shower curtain rings in it. So so there is. Can y'all see?
Wow.
That's amazing.
That is a
Beautiful.
lot of it. Thank you. And I have some samples too, because I like to, have samples when in the before times when I could like go to shows. But I was going to show y'all a little bit about. I can take my gloves off. Yay. The colorway that we just dyed, Strange But Not a Stranger. This is what it looks like when it's done.
Ooh.
So it has the greens and the blues and the purpley plummy colors, which I like very much. The other thing I think that is very interesting is things will look different on different bases. And so like this is a 2-ply fingering weight yarn. And the speckles get kind of crisp. It like has a different kind of thing. And I dyed it also on mohair silk. And mohair is just wild. Like the things that happen on mohair are just, so it's the exact same colorway, the same process, the same dye. And yeah, so that's kind of fun. So this is the what we have in the oven now is the tarhi. And so you can see it's kind of this like, gosh, I love it so much. It's kind of chunky, like it's a fingering weight, but it's a beefy fingering weight. I love it. It's my new favorite. So that's what that looks like. And so I was talking about tonals. Because Wendy is on this call. This is my friend Wendy. She came up with this colorway and we named it Empress Wendy after her. So you can see the color is not super true, which is a bummer, but this is a tonal. So you can see it has like these colors are very similar. Like it's got the blues, like the same kind of blues and greens in it. So it's not a super highly variegated yarn. So those are the ones that I like best because I am a sweater knitter. And so I like those sort of crazy rich things for garments.
Okay. So I see that Wendy has her hand raised.
Yes. Sorry,
Hi, Wendy.
I've got a lot of questions. Hi. Also, that does not do justice, that colour, and it is nothing to do with me, is so rich because I didn't understand what a tonal was before I met Kathleen. I just liked colours. It's like a peacock's eye. It's just so deep. You do the most incredible colours and that you can't see it. Anyway, my question was, you said on the stove top, bring it up to temperature. What does that mean? What does the temperature mean? Is it like boiling oil or like, what does it mean?
Excellent question. So acid dye is set at, I think it's between 185 and 195. So if you're going to do it on the stovetop, you want it to be like just at a simmer. You don't want to boil the yarn, but you want it to be like just little bubbles, steaming, low simmer. And then like what that means is the fibers are super open to take color. And so once it gets to that point, if you're going to speckle, then when the dry dye hits, it just like hits and does magical chemistry things. And so, yeah, so it is a low simmer.
Cool. Thank you.